Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you joining me today. If you will, like, share, comment on the post, and then buckle up. I've broken off way too big a passage this morning, so we're going to have to move quickly to try to be respectful of your time. Beginning Galatians chapter number 2, verse 11. And if I get on the right chapter, we'll be ready to roll. There's a lot going on here, and it's all connected. So that's the reason we're dealing with such a big passage, verses 11 down through verse 21. And I'm not going to read it to you for the sake of time because it is such a long passage. But there's a lot of meaning here, very important truth for everybody. Particularly believers. It's going to deal with backsliding. It's going to deal with self-righteousness. It deals with works. It deals with faith. It deals with the law, with grace. There are all kinds of topics here. We could probably spend several weeks just picking this passage apart. But just to give you an overview of what's going on here, Paul says that Cephas or Peter came, and he says, I opposed him. So they have a little bit of a confrontation between Peter and Paul. And just to give you a quick version of what had happened, Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch working, and Peter had came along and apparently had some services there. Antioch was a great church, the first one we believe to have sent out missionaries. Was made up largely, if not completely, of Gentile believers, those who had come out of a Gentile life, not a Jewish life. And while Peter was there, he fellowshiped with the Gentiles. It says in verse 12, he was eating with the Gentiles and fellowshipping with them and having a good time with the Gentiles. He was fellowshipping, he was eating, he was going on with that. But at some point, some Jews came to Antioch. And when they came to visit the church, they were shocked that Peter was fellowshipping with Gentiles. Even though they were Christians, they couldn't believe that he was eating with them and fellowshipping with them and doing these things. But these were men they were known as Judaizers. They believed in the gospel of Christ. But what they believed was they taught that that was in addition to what they already had. What they already had in the law, and so they believed that men had to be circumcised. They believed you had to follow the law of Moses. They continued the rituals and ceremonies from the Old Testament. You had to continue to follow all the very strict food regulations that are listed in the Old Testament, and you couldn't have any fellowship with Gentiles. They were still considered, or you couldn't have any fellowship with Gentiles who hadn't been circumcised, and so they were adding a lot to the gospel of Christ. And so when they saw what Peter was doing, they says here that they rebuked him. They came and they said something to Peter about how he was acting and what he was doing. And when he did, Peter stopped fellowshipping with the Gentiles. He stopped what he had been doing, and because of that, the church ended up in a mess. The church divided over these issues. Now, Peter has been fellowshipping with them and socializing with them, and now he withdraws, and so the church divides. And when he does, Obviously, this causes a huge problem inside of the church. And so Paul stands up and rebukes Peter for these actions. In a nutshell, what we have here is a warning against us of being hypocrites, of having double standards. In what the phrase we would use today was Peter was two-faced. When the Judaizers weren't there, he was running with the Gentiles. When they showed up, he wanted to please them. He wanted to make them happy and go along with whatever they said. And so he was afraid. What it amounts to, he was afraid of what they would think of him. And so Peter is more concerned with what man says than with what he had been taught from the gospel. And that, we don't have perhaps that exact problem today, but we do have that bigger problem of wanting to please man instead of pleasing God. Peter was again, very simply, he wasn't following the gospel. Gospel taught that God loved all men. We know what just a simple verse wanted all of us know, John 3:16. And so Peter was separating himself and from these people. He was separating himself from the Gentiles and doing, practicing something completely contrary to Scripture. And again, the simple word that we use today is he was being a hypocrite. He wasn't, he wasn't living the gospel that he had been preaching. When certain people came around, he decided to live differently. And so then Paul goes on in this verse and tells us, and we're Jews by birth, but the person is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith. Paul says to Peter, you know better, Peter. You know that it's not whether or not you've been circumcised. It's not what you eat. It's not who you eat with that makes a person righteous. It is your relationship. It is salvation through faith by grace. It's in Jesus Christ that we have been justified. Again, not by works of laws. He says, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. He says, Peter, you can't live like that in front of these people. You can't act like that in front of these people because if you do, in verse 21, he says, I do not nullify the grace of God. For if righteousness were through law, then Christ died for no purpose. He says, you are by acting like that, by making those decisions when the Judaizers came into town, you are nullifying everything you've been preaching. You're making what you have been preaching of no value. You're telling these people who you've been preaching salvation is by grace, you're now telling them, well, it's by grace sometimes. It's by grace unless, folks come from Jerusalem. It's by grace unless the Judaizers show up. But the rest of the time, salvation is by grace. But today, you can't do that. Salvation is by grace. We live in a world that, not just now, but it's always been that way. They have a real hard time understanding that salvation is the free gift of God. Man wants to do something to earn his salvation. There's just something in a man that feels like he's got to do something. But we have to remember, salvation is a free gift of God. We can't live by two standards. Salvation is a free gift, and we need to be preaching it that way. We need to be living it that way. And so Paul confronts Peter and says, don't nullify the gospel. Preach salvation by grace, live salvation by grace. Hope that's clear. Crammed a lot into a few moments, but if you've got any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them one-on-one or send me an email. message, but I hope that sums up a big passage of Scripture very quickly. All right, have a good day. We'll see you here tomorrow morning.